The Oran Rift was not a place anyone chose to be. It was not scenic. It was not strategic. It was not on any shipping lane, any patrol route, or any map that mattered to anyone with actual power in the galaxy. It was a wide, dark stretch of gravitational instability between two dead star systems, a place where space itself seemed to have given up trying to be interesting and settled instead for being quietly dangerous. Radiation pockets drifted through it like invisible weather. Gravitational currents shifted without warning. The stars nearby were old and dim, the kind that gave light the way a dying man gives advice. Barely, and without much hope it would do any good. The ISV Amaranth had been sitting in it for 11 days, not by choice. The choice had been to map the gravitational anomalies along the rift's eastern edge, a survey mission, low priority, funded by a university consortium and a small Earth government science grant that had taken 3 years to approve and would take another 2 years to report on. The Amaranth was that kind of ship. The mission was that kind of mission. Nobody sent their best vessel on a mapping survey through a dead zone. They sent the Amaranth. She was not a young ship. She had been built 26 years ago for deep space geological work, then sold, then refitted for long-range survey, then sold again, then refitted again, then acquired by the Earth Science Directorate for a price that reflected how much everyone else had given up on her. Her hull had been patched in 14 places. Her sensor array was military grade, which was the one extravagant thing about her, because without good sensors, a survey ship was just an expensive way to drift. Her living quarters were tight. Her coffee machine had been broken since Tuesday. Not this Tuesday. A Tuesday some months ago that no one could pin down exactly, because the repair had kept being postponed in favor of things that mattered more. She carried 11 people and enough supplies for 8 months. She also carried, in her belly, a gravitational mapping array that was the most sophisticated piece of equipment on the ship, and possibly the most temperamental, and which had, on day 4 of the survey, developed a feedback loop that nobody had seen before and that Yusuf Khan had been trying to fix ever since. Piath filed his reports at 0300 ship time, when the council relay was at its strongest signal and the rest of the monitoring station was quiet. He was a careful writer. He had been a council observer for 11 years, stationed on a small platform at the edge of the Oran system specifically because nothing ever happened there, and he was very good at writing reports about nothing. He was proud of this. His reports were thorough, accurate, and completely unread by anyone of importance, which suited him fine. He wrote them because the council required them, and because he found the process of careful observation soothing. He watched, he recorded, he filed. On day 11 of the Amaranth's presence in the rift, his report read as follows. Human Survey Vessel ISV Amaranth, Registry Earth Science Directorate, has been stationary in the Eastern Rift Zone for 11 standard days. Vessel appears to be conducting equipment maintenance following a reported sensor array malfunction. No distress signal has been issued. No contact has been requested. Crew complement 11. No armament on record. Vessel classification. Non-military. Research grade. Threat assessment. None. Recommend continued passive monitoring. He filed it. He made himself a cup of something warm. He watched the Amaranth on his long-range display, a small, dim shape, barely registering, sitting very still in a place where nothing ever happened. He did not know, yet, that in approximately 6 hours, everything about his job was going to change forever. Inside the Amaranth, Yusuf Khan was arguing with the ship. Not with a person. With the ship. With the specific section of conduit housing behind panel G7 in the engine room subfloor, which he had been talking to for 4 hours in a low, firm voice, the way a man talks to a dog that has gotten itself wedged under a fence. I understand you, he said. I know what you want. You want the feedback loop to resolve through the primary array housing, and I am telling you, very clearly, that is not going to happen, because if it does, we lose the array entirely, and then we have no sensors, and then we are a large, expensive rock. The conduit did not respond. Yusuf wiped sweat off his forehead with the back of his wrist and looked at the diagnostic screen balanced on his knee. The numbers were not good. They had not been good for 4 days. Every fix he made created a new problem downstream, which was the engineering equivalent of a sentence that kept adding clauses without ever finding its period. He was not panicking. Yusuf Khan did not panic. He had been an engineer for 19 years, on ships that were worse than this one, in situations that were stranger, and he had a personal philosophy about broken machines that had served him well. Everything that broke was trying to tell you something. You just had to listen long enough to hear what it was saying. What the Amaranth's gravitational array was currently saying, as far as he could tell, was something extremely technical and deeply unhelpful. He was considering his next move when the intercom crackled. Yusuf, Captain Mara Solis's voice, flat, measured, the kind of voice that only sounded like that when it was working to sound like that. Still working, he said. I know. That's not why I'm calling. A pause. We have company. Mara was standing at the bridge viewport when he got there, which told him everything about how she was feeling, because Mara only stood at the viewport when she wanted something to look at that wasn't a screen. She was a tall woman, lean, with short gray-streaked hair she'd stopped cutting somewhere around month 2, and hadn't mentioned since. She had the kind of face that had probably been pretty once, and was now something better, particular, like a landscape after weather. Yusuf looked at the main display. 43 contacts, large ones, moving in formation. Varric, he said. Varric, she confirmed. He looked at the contacts for a moment, then he looked at her. How far out? 2 hours at their current speed. Maybe less if they push. She turned from the viewport. They're heading for the Maris system. Small species there, the Quellan. 3 inhabited worlds. No real fleet. The Varric have been building a pretext for 6 months. And we're in the way. We're in the neighborhood. She sat down in her chair, not in their path exactly, but close enough that they'll want us gone before they start whatever they're planning to start. Rena Cho appeared from the corridor behind them, datapad in hand, hair escaping its tie in 3 different directions. She was 29 and operated at a frequency slightly higher than other humans, as if her brain ran on a different kind of fuel and occasionally forgot the body was attached. I've been watching the formation, she said, not as a greeting. It's a standard Varric assault configuration. The 3 heavies at the front are Dreadnought class. The outer ring is destroyer escorts. She looked up. They're not here for a conversation. No, Mara said. They're not. She looked at Yusuf. How long until we can move? Define move. Drive. Propulsion. The thing that makes us go somewhere that isn't here. Yusuf made a sound that was not quite a word. The feedback loop in the grav array is still active. If I fire the main drive right now, the power surge will go through the array housing, and we lose sensors, possibly permanently. And if you don't fix it? If I don't fix it, we stay here. Mara looked at the display. The 43 contacts were still coming. She looked at them the way she looked at most bad situations, directly, without flinching, as if flinching would somehow make it worse. How long to fix it properly? 8 hours, maybe 10. We have 2. I know. She nodded once. Do what you can. Yusuf went back to the engine room. Rena followed him, uninvited, which she always did, and which he had long ago stopped objecting to because she was occasionally useful and always interesting, like a very energetic tool that sometimes handed you the right thing without being asked. He lay back down under panel G7. Walk me through the loop again, Rena said, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him with her datapad. The grav array is designed to map external gravitational fields by generating a small internal one as a reference baseline. The feedback loop means the internal field keeps amplifying instead of stabilizing. Every time I try to interrupt it, the energy reroutes. What happens to the rerouted energy? Right now, it dissipates through the hull plating, harmlessly. He paused. Mostly harmlessly. Rena was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, which was an actual sound. A kind of rapid stylus tapping on her datapad that meant her brain was doing something. What if you didn't interrupt it, she said. He stopped what he was doing. What? What if you let the loop amplify, but instead of letting it route through the hull, you give it somewhere to go, route it into the propulsion coupling? Yusuf was quiet for 4 full seconds. That would mean the drive wouldn't be running on reaction thrust. Right. It would be running on a localized gravity field. Roughly, yes. That's not how drives work. It's not how drives are designed to work, Rena said. That's different. He thought about it. Rena's ideas had a specific quality. They were never quite safe, and they were never quite wrong, which put them in a category of their own that he had privately labeled correct, but alarming. The field would be unstable, he said. We'd move, but not in a predictable way. We'd move, she said. Isn't that the requirement? He didn't answer. He was already recalculating. The Varric hail came at hour 1 and 40 minutes. Mara took it on the main screen. The face that appeared was sharp-featured, reptilian in the way all Varric were, Scaled skin in dark green and brown, eyes with a vertical pupil that had always struck her as the eyes of something that had learned patience the hard way. The uniform was heavily decorated. The expression was not. Unregistered vessel. The translator gave his voice a flat, clean quality, stripped of tone. You are in a restricted transit corridor. You will vacate this area within 10 of your minutes, or you will be removed. Mara looked at him. She had dealt with Varric before. Not often, and not well, but enough to know that they were not bluffing species. When they said removed, they meant it in the permanent sense. This is Captain Mara Solis of the ISV Amaranth, she said. Earth Science Directorate. We are a registered survey vessel, currently undergoing emergency drive repairs. We'd love to vacate. We're working on it. A pause. The Varric commander, she could see the rank insignia, 3 horizontal bars, a fleet admiral, looked at something off-screen. You have 10 minutes, he said, and ended the hail. Mara turned to her comms officer. Get me Yusuf. Yusuf's voice came through immediately, which meant he'd been listening. I heard. 10 minutes. I know. Can you do it in 10 minutes? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. I can do something in 10 minutes. Whether it counts as doing it is a philosophical question. Yusuf, working. At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, something happened to the Amaranth. It was not a sound, exactly. It was not a feeling, exactly. It was the kind of thing that happened in the bones before it happened in the ears. A deep, low vibration that started in the floor and moved up through the chairs and into the spines of everyone sitting in them. The lights flickered once. The main display scrambled and resorted itself. And then the ship moved. Not forward, not backward, not in any direction that had a clean name. The Amaranth seemed to compress itself, or the space around it compressed. Rena would spend the next 6 months arguing about the correct terminology, and then it was somewhere slightly different than where it had been. And the process of getting there had taken 0.2 seconds and involved no thrust at all. On the bridge, Mara gripped her armrest. Yusuf, she said. Still here, he said. He sounded winded. What did you do? I'm not entirely sure, he said, but I think the drive is running. On the Varric fleet's sensors, 43 ships, all watching, the Amaranth had vanished, and then reappeared, and then vanished again. Not moving in a line, not moving in any pattern their computers had a model for, appearing and disappearing in positions that did not form a vector, did not suggest a direction, did not correspond to any drive signature in any database the Varric Empire had assembled in 600 years of expansion. Admiral Tasik stared at his display. His targeting officer looked up. Sir, we cannot establish a firing solution. Tasik said nothing. Sir, the vessel is, the officer stopped. Tried again. The vessel is not moving in a way our targeting systems can predict. The display showed the Amaranth appearing, disappearing, appearing elsewhere. No engine wash, no propulsion signature, no heat bloom, no particle trail. Nothing. Just a ship that was somewhere, and then wasn't, and then was again, and the space between those positions contained no evidence of travel. Tasik watched it for 30 seconds. He had commanded fleets for 22 years. He had fought 17 engagements. He had never, in the entirety of his career, told his targeting officer to hold fire because the target was confusing him. Hold fire, he said. Observe. The order went out to 43 ships. 43 ships held. On his monitoring station, Pieth watched all of this on his long-range sensors with the careful attention he gave to all things, and the growing feeling that his next report was going to require a great deal of very precise language. He began to type. Amendment to previous filing. The human vessel ISV Amaranth has undergone an apparent drive event of unknown classification. The vessel is exhibiting positional behavior inconsistent with any known propulsion technology. The Varric fleet, 43 vessels, assault configuration, has halted its advance and is currently observing. He stopped. Read it back. Added one more line. I am unable to determine what the human vessel is doing. I am also unable to determine if the human vessel knows what it is doing. He filed it. Then he poured himself another cup of something warm and sat back down at his display and watched the small, battered, flickering human ship that had just made 43 Varric warships stand very still and very quiet in the dark between the stars. He watched it for a long time. Outside, the rift was silent. The dead stars gave their dim light. The Varric fleet held its position, and the Amaranth kept flickering. Here, then not here, then here again, like something that had not yet decided what the rules were, and was in no particular hurry to find out. The Varric Empire had a doctrine for everything. This was not an exaggeration. In 600 years of expansion across 40% of known space, the Empire had encountered enough strange situations, hostile species, and unexpected complications that someone, at some point, had written a protocol for nearly all of them. There were doctrines for first contact, doctrines for siege warfare, doctrines for handling civilian vessels in restricted zones, doctrines for equipment failure mid-engagement, for communications blackouts, for crew mutiny, for the 17 different kinds of spatial anomaly the Empire's Science Division had catalogued and named. There was even a doctrine for vessels that did not respond to orders. It was a short doctrine. It had one step. Admiral Tasic knew all of them. He had memorized them as a young officer and refined his understanding of them over 2 decades of command. He believed in them the way some beings believed in religion, not blindly, but with the deep, structural faith of someone who had seen what happened when the doctrine was followed and what happened when it wasn't, and had noted the difference carefully. He was thinking about this now, standing at the front of his command deck, watching the display where the human vessel continued to do the thing it was doing that had no name in any doctrine he had ever read. Status, he said. His sensor officer, a young male named Varric who had the unfortunate quality of looking exactly as frightened as he felt, looked up from his station. Vessel continues to exhibit non-standard positional behavior, Admiral. Current count, 47 displacement events in the last 18 minutes. Pattern? Varric hesitated. There is no pattern, sir. Tasic looked at him. I mean, there is no predictive pattern. The displacements are not random. They appear. He stopped. Tried again. They appear purposeful, sir. But we cannot model the purpose. Tasic turned back to the display. The human ship sat there, or didn't sit there exactly, because sitting implied stillness, and this vessel was not still, even when it appeared to be. It shimmered at the edges of his sensors. It existed in a way that kept sliding away from definition. Weapons, he said. His weapons officer, older, steadier, a veteran named Sorath who had been with him for 9 years, pulled up the targeting array. Targeting solution is incomplete, Admiral. The system cannot establish a stable lock. Every projection places the vessel in a position it has already vacated by the time the calculation completes. How long to force a lock? Sorath looked at his screen, back at Tasic. Unknown, sir. The targeting algorithm is iterating. It has not converged. Tasic was quiet. In 22 years of command, he had never waited this long for a targeting solution on a single, unarmored, research-grade vessel. He clasped his hands behind his back. Continue observing. In the engine room of the Amaranth, the situation was best described as controlled chaos, with the emphasis shifting between those 2 words depending on which second you chose to evaluate it. Yusuf was back under panel G7. He had not left the engine room in 6 hours. He had eaten half a nutrition block and drunk 2 cups of water, and at some point someone had left a cup of actual coffee near his elbow, which meant Mara had come down herself, because no one else on the ship made coffee that bad, and somehow it was still the most comforting thing he had seen all day. The gravitational array was singing. That was the word that kept coming to him, and he kept rejecting it because engineers did not use that word, but there it was. The array had found a frequency, a resonance between the feedback loop and the propulsion coupling that Rena had suggested, and that he had implemented with approximately 30% confidence and 60% desperation, and the result was something that hummed at a register he felt in his back teeth. It was not supposed to do that. A lot of things were not supposed to be happening that were happening. Rena, he said. She was 3 feet away, sitting on an equipment crate with her legs folded under her, her datapad connected directly to the array's secondary sensor feed. She had been in that position for 2 hours. She had the expression of someone watching the most interesting thing they had ever seen, and trying very hard not to wake it up by reacting too strongly. Still here, she said. Talk to me about what the field is doing. It's beautiful, she said. That is not a technical description. It's bending local space, she said, switching registers without apology. The array generates a reference gravity field as a baseline for mapping. Normally that field is tiny, controlled, contained, barely measurable. but the feedback loop amplified it past the containment threshold, and when you routed it into the propulsion coupling, the drive started using that field instead of reaction thrust. She paused. The ship isn't moving through space, it's moving space. Yusuf stared at the conduit he was holding. That's not possible. And yet, we don't have the power generation for that. We don't have the power generation for a stable version of that, she said. What we have is an unstable version that keeps spiking and releasing. Every spike moves the ship. Every release drops it back into normal space. The interval between spikes is irregular because the feedback loop doesn't have a fixed period. She looked up from her datapad. To any external sensor, we're appearing and disappearing at irregular intervals in positions that don't correspond to any known drive vector. Yusuf thought about this for a long moment. Can anyone outside this room lock onto us? Rena smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just done a calculation they very much enjoyed. No. On the bridge, Mara was learning the specific kind of patience required when you were in danger, and could not do anything about the danger, except wait for someone else to fix the thing that had put you in the danger in the first place. She was not good at this kind of patience. She was good at the kind of patience that involved doing something, making calls, pulling data, making decisions. The waiting kind she had always found physically uncomfortable, like wearing a coat that was one size too small. She sat in her chair and watched the Varric fleet on the display and did not let any of it show on her face. They haven't moved, her comms officer said. A young woman named Dessa, 24, on her first deep space posting. She was handling it well. Her voice was only slightly too careful. No, Mara said. Do you think they're going to fire? Mara looked at the 43 contacts arrayed across her display. 43 ships. The smallest of them was 3 times the Amaranth's mass. The largest was something she didn't like to think about. If they could, she said, they would have already. Dessa was quiet for a moment. Why can't they? Ask Yusuf. As if on cue, the intercom clicked. Yusuf's voice, slightly muffled, as if he was talking from inside something. Mara, talk to me. Short version. The drive is working, but not in a way I can control precisely. We're moving, but not predictably. Rena says nobody outside can get a lock on us. Can you steer? A pause that had texture to it. Define steer. Can you make us go in a direction that is generally away from 43 Varric warships? Another pause. I can make us go in a direction. Whether it's the right direction requires some iteration. Iterate toward away from them. Working on it. The intercom clicked off. Mara looked at the display. The fleet was still holding. She pulled up her records on Varric military doctrine. She'd read them once, 2 years ago, for a completely different reason, and found the section on non-compliant vessels in restricted zones. She read it twice. The doctrine was clear. Vessels that did not comply with withdrawal orders were to be destroyed. No exceptions, no further warnings. The Varric fleet had not destroyed them. She sat with that for a moment. Then she understood it, and the understanding was a cold and careful thing that settled at the base of her spine. They hadn't fired because they couldn't get a lock, and they hadn't gotten a lock because the Amaranth, in its broken and improvised way, had become something their targeting systems didn't have a model for. They weren't safe. They were a category error. Tasic gave the order at the 90-minute mark. He did not give it lightly. He had spent 90 minutes observing, gathering data, waiting for his targeting systems to resolve, and coming to the conclusion, slowly, the way a structural engineer comes to the conclusion that a building is going to fall, that the resolution was not coming. All batteries, he said, fire at last known position, spread pattern, maximum dispersal. It was not a precise order. He knew it was not a precise order. He was not firing to hit the vessel. He had accepted, in a quiet and deeply uncomfortable part of his mind, that hitting the vessel was not currently possible. He was firing to fill space, to make the area around the vessel so saturated with weapons fire that even an unpredictable target could not avoid all of it. It was the kind of order you gave when the doctrine had run out. 43 ships fired. The space around the Amaranth became, very briefly, a solid geometry of weapons fire, plasma bolts and kinetic rounds and particle beams crossing and recrossing the area in a pattern designed to leave no empty volume. At the moment of firing, the Amaranth's grav array spiked. This was not a response. This was not a countermeasure. This was Yusuf, 3 seconds before the order was given, yanking a coupling loose because the feedback frequency had shifted, and he needed to reroute the power draw before the array burned out its secondary housing. The ship displaced 4,300 kilometers. The salvo hit empty space. The silence on Tassik's command deck was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Every officer was looking at their screen, not at him, at their screens, because looking at him required acknowledging that he was looking back, and what was on his face was something none of them wanted to have seen. "Damage assessment," he said. His voice was even. He had excellent control of his voice. "No confirmed hits, Admiral," Sorath said. "The vessel displaced at the moment of firing." "Displaced?" "Yes, sir." "How far?" "Approximately 4,300 kilometers, Admiral. Sorath paused. "In no direction that corresponds to any vector projected from its previous position." Tassik looked at the display. The Amaranth had reappeared on the far side of the engagement zone, not retreating, not advancing, just there, where it had not been, with no evidence of how it had gotten there. "Reacquire," he said. "Working, sir." They worked for 14 minutes. At the end of 14 minutes, Tassik's targeting officer looked up from his station with the expression of a man delivering news that he would genuinely rather not deliver. "Admiral, we cannot establish a firing solution. The vessel's positional behavior remains outside targeting parameters." Tassik said nothing. "Sir, our computers have run 11,000 iterations of the targeting algorithm. In every iteration, by the time the solution is calculated, the vessel has displaced." "We cannot—" He stopped. "We cannot hit it, sir." Another silence. From the back of the deck, someone, junior, young, possibly someone who would have a very short career if he made a habit of this, said, very quietly, "What is it doing?" No one answered. In the engine room, Rena had started making sounds. Not words exactly. Sounds. A rapid, high-pitched sequence of syllables that had the rhythm of language but the content of pure sensation. She was doing it while staring at her datapad and furiously writing notes, and Yusuf had learned over the past 6 hours that this meant she had found something. "Rena, the field," she said. "The gravity field. When it spikes. When we displace. It's not just moving us. It's moving space. The local metric shifts." She looked up. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she had gone somewhere in her head that most people couldn't follow. "Do you understand what that means for anything caught in the shift boundary?" "It means they feel a gravitational event," he said. "It means they feel a gravitational event that their instruments cannot distinguish from a naturally occurring anomaly," she said. "We're not a ship to their sensors. We're a moving gravitational feature. We look like a piece of the rift." Yusuf put down his tool, looked at her. "We look like the rift," he said. "Yes. They're trying to shoot a piece of geography." "Yes." He picked his tool back up. "Well," he said, "that explains that." Tassik called High Command at the 2-hour mark. This was not something he did casually. Fleet admirals did not call High Command from the field unless the situation required it, and situations that required it were, in his experience, situations that ended careers. He had called High Command twice in 22 years. Both times had been significant. This would be the third. He made the call from his private station, off the command deck. He reported what had happened. The vessel, the displacement events, the failed targeting solutions, the salvo. He reported it cleanly, without emphasis, because emphasis would have made it worse. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Send us your sensor data." "I have already transmitted it," Tassik said. Another silence. "Is the vessel armed?" "We have detected no weapons systems." "Has it taken any aggressive action?" Tassik considered the question. "It has not responded to our withdrawal order," he said. "Beyond that, no." "Then what is it doing?" He looked at the sensor feed on his private screen, the Amaranth flickering, there and not there, a ship that moved like a gap in the data. "I don't know," he said. It was the first time in 22 years he had said those 3 words to High Command. He felt them leave his mouth and knew they would not come back. High Command told him to hold position and await a specialist science vessel. The science vessel was 2 hours out. It carried the Empire's best sensor analysts and the most advanced scanning equipment in the fleet. Tassik acknowledged the order, ended the call, sat alone in his private station for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he stood, straightened his uniform, and went back to the command deck. Piath had been watching for 2 hours and his tea had gone cold twice, and he had not noticed either time. He was writing continuously now, which was unusual for him. He was a careful writer, a slow writer, a man who chose words the way a jeweler chose settings, carefully, with attention to what they were supporting. He did not write continuously. He was writing continuously. Amendment, second filing. The Varric fleet has executed a full battery firing solution against the human vessel. The firing solution was unsuccessful. The human vessel displaced the engagement zone entirely at the moment of firing. No damage observed. The vessel has reappeared at coordinates approximately 4,300 kilometers from its previous position. He stopped. I want to note for the record that I have been observing this vessel for 11 days and have filed no fewer than 14 reports classifying it as non-threatening. I am not retracting those reports. I am noting that the category of non-threatening may require subdivision. He stopped again. The Varric fleet is holding position. They are not pursuing. They are not firing. They are watching. He looked at the display. The Amaranth was still there, still flickering, still being whatever it was. In 11 years of observation, I have watched 3 Varric engagements. In all 3 cases, the Varric fired until the target was destroyed and then the Varric left. In no case did the Varric watch. They are watching. I find this more alarming than anything else I have observed today. He filed the report, looked at his cold tea, didn't drink it. On the display, the Amaranth shimmered and displaced and reappeared, and the 43 warships of the Varric Empire did nothing at all, which was somehow the most frightening thing in the dark. The science vessel was called the Varith Secundus, and it was the finest thing the Varric Empire had ever built that was not designed to destroy something. It had taken 30 years to construct. Its sensor arrays could detect a single atom of hydrogen at a distance of 10,000 kilometers. Its databanks held the complete scientific output of the Empire across 6 centuries. Every measurement, every classification, every carefully documented phenomenon the Varric had encountered as they moved across 40% of known space, and named things, and recorded them, and filed them in the correct order. It arrived at the edge of the Oran Rift at hour 3, sliding into position behind Tassik's fleet with the quiet confidence of something that knew it was the most sophisticated instrument in any room it entered. Its senior analyst was a female named Drath. She had spent 40 years studying anomalous spatial phenomena. She had written the Empire's definitive text on non-standard drive signatures. She had personally catalogued 11 previously unclassified forms of gravitational distortion. She looked at the Amaranth on her display for approximately 4 minutes. Then she said, "Run the full spectrum scan, all bands. I want continuous data." Her team ran it. Drath watched the results come in. She watched the Amaranth displace. She watched it reappear. She watched the gravitational readings spike and release in their irregular pattern. She watched her instruments try to build a model of what they were seeing and fail, and then try again, and fail differently. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, carefully, the way a person speaks when they are committing to a position and know they will be held to it. This vessel is generating a localized gravity fold, a controlled, directed, repeating gravity fold. The displacement events are the result of metric manipulation. The vessel is bending local space and using the distortion as a propulsion mechanism. Her junior analyst, a young male named Paris, who had been with her for 3 years and had learned to read the specific quality of her silences, said, "Is that possible?" "It is happening," Drath said. "That makes it possible. We've never seen it before." "We've never seen it before," she agreed. "Which means either we have not been looking in the right places, or," she paused, "or the humans developed it without us noticing." Paris looked at the display, at the small, battered ship that was doing the impossible thing. "They've been spacefaring for 200 years, he said. "We've been spacefaring for 600. "Yes," Drath said. "They couldn't have, and yet." She began composing her report to Tassik. Her hands, Paris noticed, were not entirely steady. Inside the Amaranth, the situation was the following. Yusuf was still under panel G7. He had been under panel G7, with brief intervals above it, for going on 8 hours. His back hurt. His knees hurt. The specific joint in his right shoulder that had bothered him since a bad fall on a previous ship had decided that this was the moment to register a formal complaint. He was ignoring all of it. The coupling he was currently holding had 3 possible configurations. Configuration A would restore normal drive function and shut down the gravity fold entirely, which would solve the engineering problem and leave them sitting still in front of 43 warships. Configuration B would maintain the fold but reduce its stability, which would keep them moving but increase the risk of a catastrophic feedback event that Rena had described with the cheerful detachment of someone who found catastrophic feedback events genuinely interesting. Configuration C he had invented 10 minutes ago and was not yet sure about. "Rena," he said. "Still here," she said. She had moved from the equipment crate to the floor, lying on her back with her datapad held above her face, which was how she worked when she was thinking hardest. Configuration C. "Tell me. I reroute the power draw through the secondary coupling but leave the primary loop active. The fold continues but the spike interval stabilizes. We get more predictable displacement." She was quiet for a moment. "How predictable?" "Not very. But more than now?" "More than now." Another moment. "What's the risk?" "If the secondary coupling can't handle the draw, it fails. The energy has nowhere to go. It reroutes back through the array housing. And then the array housing fails. The fold collapses. Drive goes offline. We stop moving. We stop moving." Rena considered this. "What's the upside?" "If it works," Yusuf said, "I can give Mara something closer to actual steering. She can edge us toward the rift boundary, not fast, but directional." Rena lowered her datapad and looked at the ceiling. "Do it," she said. "You're very casual about catastrophic failure scenarios," he said. "I'm very curious about what happens," she said. "It's different." He did not have a good response to this. He started on Configuration C. Search and Sfei. Mara was on the bridge when Dessa flagged the new contact. "Second vessel, Captain. Smaller than the warships, different configuration." Dessa pulled up the profile. I think it's a science vessel. Varric registry. It's taking up position at the rear of the fleet." Mara looked at it. A science vessel. They had sent a science vessel. She thought about what that meant. The fleet couldn't classify what the Amaranth was doing, so they'd sent people whose job was classification. That was a reasonable response. It was also, in a way she could not entirely explain, more worrying than another warship would have been. More warships meant they wanted to fight. A science vessel meant they wanted to understand. Understanding led to solutions. "How long has it been scanning us?" she said. "It started active scans about 6 minutes ago," Dessa said. "Full spectrum, all bands." Mara nodded. She pulled up her own display and looked at the Amaranth's current status. Drive, operational in the approximate sense. Hull, intact. Crew, 11 people, all accounted for. None of them thrilled, but all of them functional. Supplies, fine. Coffee machine, still broken, a separate and ongoing tragedy. She called the engine room. "Yusuf, there's a Varric science vessel scanning us." A pause. She could hear him working, the specific sound of tools in tight spaces. How sophisticated. "Very. Are they going to figure out what we're doing?" She thought about that. "Probably," she said. "Given enough time." "How much time do we have?" "Less than we'd like." Another pause. "I'm implementing something. Give me 20 minutes. "You have 20 minutes, she said. She ended the call and sat back in her chair. Dessa was looking at her with the careful attention of someone who wanted to ask a question, but wasn't sure if it was the right time. "Ask," Mara said. "If the science vessel figures out what we're doing," Dessa said. "If they figure out that the drive malfunctioned and this is all accidental, then they know we're not a threat," Mara said. "Then they know we've been sitting here, unable to move, and everything they've seen is a consequence of a broken engine and one engineer improvising. And then they fire. And then they fire," Mara said. "And Yusuf's modified drive cannot get us out of the way of 43 ships firing with a complete targeting solution." She paused. "So let's hope Yusuf's 20 minutes goes well." Dessa turned back to her station. Mara looked at the display. At the science vessel, scanning. At the fleet, waiting. At the rift beyond, dark and wide and entirely indifferent to all of them. She thought about the last time she'd been genuinely afraid. She stopped thinking about it. The 20 minutes went to 19 when Yusuf tried configuration C, and the secondary coupling, under the load he had projected but somehow not quite believed in, made a sound like a very large and very unhappy animal, and then did something he had not predicted. It held. But in holding, It changed the draw pattern in a way that fed back into the primary loop at a different frequency, and the primary loop, already running at something it had not been designed to run at, amplified that frequency, and the amplified frequency hit the propulsion coupling with approximately 3 times the energy Yusuf had planned for. The Amaranth lurched. This was not a displacement. The previous movements had been relatively smooth in the sense that they had been short, sharp, positionally discrete events. Here, then elsewhere. This was a lurch, a physical thing that people felt in their bodies, and their chairs, and their inner ears. The ship moved forward 40,000 kilometers, in 2 and 0.3 seconds, without acceleration, without inertia. One moment the Amaranth was in a position relative to the Varric fleet that could be described as close. The next moment it was in a position that could be described as somewhere else entirely, having crossed 40,000 kilometers in a third of a second, and every person on board had felt it as a single instant of wrongness, a gap in the sensation of existing, and then it was done. On the bridge, Mara was gripping both armrests. "Yusuf," she said. Her voice was very even. "Here," he said. He sounded like a man who had just done something unexpected and was still calculating whether it was good or bad. What was that? Configuration C had a secondary effect I didn't model. "Yes," she said. "I noticed. We moved. 40,000 kilometers," Dessa said, reading her display, "in 0.3 seconds. A silence in the engine room. Then, "Huh," Yusuf said. "Huh," Mara agreed. On the Varath Secundus, the effect of the Amaranth's 40,000 kilometer displacement on the science vessel's instruments was immediate and total. The gravity fold, when it spiked at 3 times its previous amplitude, sent a shockwave through local space. Not a weapon, not a targeted event, a byproduct. The same way a ship moving through water sends a wave to the shore without intending to reach the shore. The shockwave hit the Varath Secundus's sensor arrays at full strength, because the sensor arrays were, by design, maximally sensitive to exactly this kind of spatial event. Maximally sensitive instruments receiving an input 3 times larger than their calibrated maximum do not process the excess gracefully. Every sensor array on the Varath Secundus overloaded simultaneously. The power surge traveled through the array housing into the primary data systems. The primary data systems, which were the finest the Empire had ever built, failed in sequence. Not catastrophically, not with fire or explosion, but cleanly and completely, the way a very precise instrument fails when asked to do something it was never built for. The Varath Secundus went dark. Not destroyed, not burning. Dark, silent, drifting, every instrument offline. 40 years of the Empire's best sensor technology sitting cold and useless in a ship that was otherwise completely intact and completely blind. Drath sat in the sudden quiet of her command center and looked at the blank screens where her data had been and did not speak for a very long time. Tasik watched the Varath Secundus go dark on his display. He watched it the way a man watches a thing he does not have a category for, with complete external stillness and something happening behind his eyes that his face was not reporting. "Status of the Varath Secundus," he said. His comms officer was already on it. "No response to hails, Admiral. Power signature suggests full instrument failure. Hull is intact. Life support is active." A pause. "They're alive, sir, but they're blind." "What caused it?" "The human vessel's displacement event. The gravity spike, the shockwave from the metric shift, overloaded their sensor arrays." His comms officer paused again, in the way people paused when they were about to say something they weren't sure should be said. "Admiral, the shockwave was not directed at the Varath Secundus. It appears to have been incidental." Tasik turned to look at him. "Incidental." The vessel moved. The shockwave was a byproduct of the movement. The Varath Secundus was in the path. The comms officer met his eyes, and then found something important to look at on his screen. It was not, as far as we can determine, a targeted strike. Tasik turned back to the main display. The Amaranth sat 40,000 kilometers from where it had been. 40,000 kilometers, in a third of a second, with no drive signature his instruments could identify. And now his science vessel was dark, and the most sophisticated sensor package the Empire had sent was sitting blind in the middle of the rift, and the human ship was just there, in its new position, doing the flickering thing, being whatever it was. He called it. Opened a channel to the Amaranth. Waited. It took 4 seconds for a response. The face that appeared was the same one as before, the human female, the captain, the one who had told him she would love to vacate, and her drive was broken. She looked, if anything, slightly more tired than she had before. There was something in her expression that he spent a moment trying to classify and then gave up on. "Admiral," she said, not a question. "What?" Tasek said. "Did you just do to my science vessel?" She looked at him for a moment. He watched her face do something subtle, a calculation, or a decision, or both. "I'm not authorized," she said, "to discuss this vessel's capabilities." The words were even, calm. They carried no threat, no edge, no emphasis. They were simply a door, closed. Tasek stared at her. She looked back at him, waiting. He ended the call. He stood at his station for a long time after that. His crew did not speak. They had learned, over 9 years with him, what his silences meant. This one meant something none of them had words for yet. Sorath, his weapons officer, the veteran, the steady one, came to stand beside him, not to report, just to stand. Tasek did not look at him. "Sir," Sorath said, very quietly. "Not now," Tasek said. Sorath went back to his station. Tasek looked at the display, at the Amaranth, at the blind science vessel drifting nearby, at his fleet, 43 ships, the finest military force the Empire had deployed in the outer reach, sitting still while one small human vessel with no weapons on record moved in ways that made his targeting systems useless and his science vessel dark. He thought about doctrine. He thought about the part of doctrine that said, "Destroy what you cannot classify." He thought about the part of doctrine that did not say, because no one had ever thought to write it, what to do when destroying what you cannot classify is not possible. He thought about the call to high command, about the words he had said. "I don't know." He thought about Drath, on the Verath Secundus, sitting in the dark. He clasped his hands behind his back and watched the display and let himself, for the first time in 22 years of command, sit with a thing he did not understand, without reaching immediately for the answer. Piath's third report was the longest he had ever filed. He had been writing it in real time as events unfolded, adding sections and amendments as each new thing happened, until it had become something closer to a document than a report, a record of something he was watching and could not look away from. He filed it. Then he sat back and looked at the Amaranth on his display. He had a habit, when observing things he didn't understand, of trying to describe them to himself in the simplest possible language. Not scientific language, plain language, the kind of words a person used when they were not trying to be precise, but just trying to be true. He looked at the Amaranth. It was a small ship, old, patched in several places his sensors could identify. No weapons, no armor worth the name, 11 crew, a broken drive that was apparently doing something nobody had a word for. It had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It had not tried to fight. It had not tried to flee. It had just kept being there, in its broken and flickering way, and the entire Varric fleet had not been able to do anything about it, and the finest science vessel the Empire had ever built was now sitting dark and blind 40,000 kilometers away. Not because the Amaranth had tried to do any of that, because it had been trying to fix its engine. Piath sat with this for a moment. Then he added one more line to his report before transmitting. "I want to note that I have now observed this vessel for the better part of one standard day. In that time it has made no aggressive action, issued no threats, and as far as I can determine, has been entirely occupied with trying to leave. I think it is important that the Council understand this. The Varric fleet cannot remove it, and it is just trying to leave." He transmitted the report, looked at the cold tea he still hadn't drunk, drank it, made a face. Outside, the rift sat quiet and dark, and the Amaranth flickered in it like a candle that had no idea it was the only light anyone was looking at. The order took 4 hours to come. Tasek did not give it immediately. He was not a man who made decisions from the place where fear lived, and he needed time to be sure that was not where this decision was coming from. So he waited. He gathered what data he could from the Verath Secundus, which was not much, because the Verath Secundus was still dark, and its crew was working on restoring basic systems with whatever they had that didn't require the sensor arrays, which was less than they would have liked. He reviewed every displacement event the fleet's cameras had captured. He ran his own calculations, separate from his officers, on a private terminal. He did not reach a conclusion. That was the problem. Every time he followed the data toward a conclusion, The data stopped making sense before he got there. The human vessel was doing something. He knew it was doing something. He had watched it do it for the better part of a day. He could not name what it was, which meant he could not counter it, which meant everything the Empire's military doctrine assumed about the relationship between understanding and defeating an enemy had, somewhere in the last several hours, quietly stopped applying. He thought about the last time the Varric Empire had retreated. He had to go back through history to find it. Not recent history, old history, the kind that lived in archives and was taught to young officers as a lesson about the price of miscalculation. The Battle of Soren's Gap, 400 years ago, a navigational catastrophe, not a military defeat. The fleet had not been beaten. It had been trapped by a collapsed transit point and forced to withdraw rather than face destruction. The Empire did not call it a retreat in the official histories. They called it a tactical redeployment in response to environmental conditions. Tasic thought about this phrase for a long time. Then he went back to his command deck. He called his senior commanders to a channel. 6 individuals, all of them experienced, all of them people whose respect he had spent 22 years earning one engagement at a time. He looked at their faces on the screen. They looked back at him. He did not say retreat. "We will regroup," he said, "and reassess the nature of this contact." He kept his voice level and his face still, and put no particular weight on any word. "The situation requires information we do not currently have. We will withdraw to a staging position outside the rift boundary, consolidate our data, and await further instruction from High Command." He paused. "Acknowledge," he said. One by one, they acknowledged. Their faces were careful, controlled. These were experienced officers. They knew what this was. Not one of them said the word either. When they were gone, Tasic stood alone at his private station for a moment. He was aware of something that he did not have a clean word for. Not shame exactly, and not fear, and not anger, though there were traces of all of them. It was more like the feeling of a structure shifting, something he had built his understanding of the world on, moving in a way structures were not supposed to move. He thought about the Amaranth, about the captain's face, about the particular quality of her stillness when she had said she was not authorized to discuss the vessel's capabilities. He had been looking for deception in that face and had not found it. He had been looking for confidence, the confidence of a weapon carrier, the specific quality that came from knowing you had force behind you, and had not found that either. What he had found, and spent several hours trying to classify, was something that looked almost like inconvenience. As if this entire situation was, for her, an interruption of something else she had been planning to do. He could not make that make sense. He stopped trying. He went back to the command deck and gave the order to the fleet. 43 ships turned. It was not a dramatic thing, seen from inside. Ships did not spin on their axes the way small craft did. They moved with the heavy deliberateness of large objects. Slow at first, then finding their momentum, the turn taking several minutes to complete, the formation reshaping itself as it did. Tasic watched the process on his display the way he watched all things, directly, without looking away from what it was. 43 ships, turning away from one unarmed research vessel. He watched until it was done. Then he looked at the display one more time, at the Amaranth, still there, still flickering, still being whatever it was, and then he turned away from it. He did not look at it again. Rena saw it first. She was still in the engine room, still on the floor, her datapad now connected to the long-range sensor feed, because Yusuf had figured out how to pipe the bridge display down to the subfloor, and she had not been back to the bridge in 6 hours, and showed no signs of going. She was watching the fleet signatures because watching the fleet signatures was, under the circumstances, a reasonable thing to do. She watched them shift. She watched the formation change. She watched the vectors alter from static holding to moving away. She sat up. "Yusuf," she said. He was elbow-deep in the secondary coupling housing. "Still working. The fleet is moving." A pause. The sound of tools stopping. "Moving how?" "Away," she said. "All of them. The whole formation is. They're pulling back." She stared at her display. "They're leaving." Yusuf came out from under the panel. He had grease on his jaw, and his hair was doing several different things. He took the datapad from her and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. "Huh," he said. "You keep saying that. It keeps being the right word." She took the datapad back. The fleet signatures were clear and steady. 43 contacts, all of them moving. All of them on vectors that led away from the rift, away from the Amaranth, away from the Quellan system they had come to demonstrate force against. Moving with the unhurried, heavy purpose of large ships that had decided somewhere else was where they needed to be. "They're really leaving," Rena said. "Yes," Yusuf said. A silence between them, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that came after a long and exhausting thing had stopped being quite so immediate. Then Rena said, "Do you think they know?" "Know what?" "That it was an accident." She looked at him. "The drive, the fold, all of it. Do you think they know it wasn't, that we weren't?" "No," Yusuf said. He looked at the display again. "No, I don't think they know that." Rena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone reaching a conclusion they found genuinely interesting, "We accidentally scared the Varric Empire." "Yes," Yusuf said, "with a broken engine. And your idea about the coupling, and your implementation, which didn't go as planned, which went better than planned," Rena said. Yusuf considered this. "In terms of outcome," he allowed. "Yes." He put the datapad down and went back to the coupling housing. "Tell Mara," he said. Mara looked at her display for a long time after Dessa told her. She was aware of something happening in her chest that she was not going to examine closely. It was not relief exactly. Relief came after the danger was clearly over, and the danger was not clearly over, and she was not a person who felt things before it was time to feel them. It was something smaller and quieter, the sensation of a breath taken before anyone noticed you needed one. She looked at the fleet signatures, watched them moving, watched them getting smaller on her display as the distance opened. "Yusuf," she said into the intercom. "I heard." His voice was calm. "I'm finishing the work on the coupling. Give me another hour. I can give you 40% thrust on a standard drive. A stable, predictable. A pause. We won't be a phantom anymore. We'll just be a ship. Will 40% get us out of the rift?" "Yes. Slowly." "Slowly is fine," she said. "Slowly is excellent." She sat back in her chair. "How's the drive housing?" "Tired," he said. "Like everything else." "One more hour," she said. "One more hour," he agreed. She ended the call, looked at her display. The fleet was still moving, still pulling back, still making the distance between them and the Amaranth into something that felt survivable. Dessa was looking at her. Dessa had been trying not to look at her for the past several minutes and had been unsuccessful. "They're really leaving," Dessa said. "They're really leaving," Mara said. "Because of us." Mara looked at the display, at the 43 signatures getting smaller. She thought about the Quellan, the species on 3 worlds in the system beyond the rift, who had been watching a Varric assault fleet build its approach for 6 months, and had no fleet of their own, and no leverage, and no options except to wait for what was coming. The fleet was not going to the Quellan system today. Maybe not tomorrow. Word would travel. Things like this always traveled. A Varric fleet retreating from a single vessel, unarmored, research class, human. That was the kind of thing that got repeated on every trading route in the Outer Reach before the week was out. She thought about what that meant, not for the Amaranth, for everything after the Amaranth. She thought about Rena's coupling idea and Yusuf's implementation, and the secondary effect that nobody had modeled, and the 40,000-kilometer lurch that had blinded the science vessel. She thought about 11 people on a patched-up ship with a broken coffee machine who had spent a very long day not dying by means of competence and improvisation, and the specific human gift of making something broken do something new. She did not let any of this show on her face. "Make sure Yusuf gets something to eat," she said to Dessa, "and see if you can do anything about the coffee machine." The news moved faster than the Amaranth. There were 214 monitoring stations within relay distance of the Oran Rift. They had all been watching. They had all been transmitting. The Galactic Council's communication network was, among its many functions, one of the most efficient rumor distribution systems in the known galaxy, because the Council was made up of small and medium-sized species who had survived in a galaxy full of larger and more powerful ones, primarily by knowing things quickly and sharing them widely. By the time the Amaranth's drive was running on 40% stable thrust and Yusuf had emerged from the engine room floor for the first time in 9 hours, and Mara had finally gotten something that was approximately coffee from the machine that Dessa had approximately fixed, the news was already 5 relay stations out. By the time the Amaranth cleared the rift boundary and set a course for human space, it was everywhere. Not accurate news. The news was not accurate. The news was never accurate when it traveled this fast, because accuracy required time and verification, and neither of those were the point when the point was the shape of the thing, the outline, the essential fact that was too large to need the details to be true. The essential fact was this: the Varric Empire had retreated. From one ship, a human ship. The details the news provided varied considerably by source. Some said the human vessel had a weapon that bent space. Some said it had survived direct fire from the full fleet without damage. Some said it had destroyed the Empire's science vessel. Some said the captain had issued an ultimatum that had never been made public. Some said the ship had simply appeared where it was, and the fleet had turned around immediately upon seeing it, without exchanging fire at all. None of these were accurate. All of them were, in the important sense, true. The Quellan received the news before the day was out. There was a word in their language that translated, roughly, as the particular joy of the reprieve, not just relief, but the specific quality of joy that only existed because something terrible had almost happened, and then had not. A word for the feeling of the door that opened instead of closing. They used it to name the day. They used a human word for the ship. They didn't have another name for it. The monitoring data showed its registry, ISV Amaranth. They kept the name. They wrote it down. They taught it to their children in the way that small species who had survived long enough to have history taught the things that mattered. Tasik, withdrawing at the front of his fleet, received the first news transmissions 2 hours into the withdrawal. He read them in his private station. He read the descriptions of the human vessel, the weapon that bent space, the armor that absorbed fire, the captain's ultimatum, and he sat with them for a long time. He did not correct them. He did not issue a statement. He did not contact the news relays. He did not tell anyone what he had actually seen, or what his targeting officer had actually said, or what the words "I cannot hit it" had felt like in a room full of officers who trusted him to have answers. He sat in his private station and read the news about the thing that had happened, and said nothing, and the silence was the most honest thing he had done all day. On the Amaranth, the night cycle came, and the crew ate actual food for the first time in 9 hours, and Yusuf slept for 4 hours in his clothes, and Rena filled 17 pages of notes, and Dessa fixed the coffee machine to a level of functionality that, while not impressive, was better than nothing. Mara sat on the bridge alone. She had the comms feed open on low volume, the council relay traffic, the news transmissions, the chatter from the monitoring stations. She was not really listening. She was aware of it the way you were aware of weather, its presence, its direction, the general shape of what it was doing. She had pulled up the sensor log from the engagement. She watched it once, from beginning to end. The fleet arriving, the hail, Yusuf's first modification, the displacement events, the salvo that missed, the science vessel going dark, the fleet turning. 11 hours, compressed to a sensor record. She sat with it for a while. Then she pulled up the mission brief she had filed before departure. Survey mission, gravitational mapping, Eastern Rift boundary, 11 days, return to Earth station. She had written it in the matter-of-fact language of a thing that was going to be straightforward and unremarkable, because it had been supposed to be straightforward and unremarkable. She thought about retirement. She had been thinking about retirement before this mission, not seriously. She had been thinking about it the way you thought about a chair in a shop window, noticing it, knowing you could buy it, not quite going in. She had this mission, and then the desk job they were going to give her, and then, eventually, something quieter. Something that did not require her to be responsible for 11 people in a broken ship in the dark. She looked at the sensor log on her screen. She thought about the Quellan on their 3 worlds, waiting for what was coming. She thought about Yusuf, who had taken a broken feedback loop and a dangerous idea and 8 hours of physical discomfort and turned it into something nobody had a name for yet. She thought about Rena, 17 pages of notes into something that was going to change what humanity knew about how space moved. She thought about Dessa, who had fixed the coffee machine. She closed the mission brief. She did not open the retirement file. She drank her coffee, bad but warm and present, and sat on the bridge of the old ship that was moving slowly and stably through the edge of the rift, and outside the viewport the stars were the particular cold and particular many that they always were in deep space, and she looked at them for a while without thinking about anything specific. On the long range, the last of the Varric fleet signatures faded past the edge of sensor range. Gone. The Amaranth moved on. Piath filed his fourth report from the monitoring station, and for the first time in 11 years, he filed it before 0300. He could not wait. He did not have the patience for 0300. He filed it at 1847 and then sat at his station and watched the Amaranth's drive signature, stable, now, 40% thrust, moving in a straight line like a ship that knew where it was going, until it passed beyond his own sensor range. The last line of his fourth report read, "The human vessel has cleared the rift boundary under its own power, and is on a course consistent with return to human space. The Varric fleet has withdrawn entirely. The Quellan system is, as of this filing, unmolested. I have been an observer for 11 years. I have watched a great many things. I want to note, for the record and for whoever reads these reports, that I do not think I have understood what I watched today. I have described it. I have measured it. I have filed it in the correct format with the correct timestamp, but I do not think I understand it. I will file a full analysis when I do." He transmitted it. He sat back in his chair. He thought about the Amaranth, about what it was: old, small, patched, 11 people, one broken coffee machine now apparently repaired, one drive that had malfunctioned into something the galaxy did not have a word for yet. He thought about the Varric fleet, 43 ships, 600 years of expansion, the finest military force the Outer Reach had ever seen. Gone. He thought about the captain's face on the transmission he had watched from Tassik's feed, the public record, available to all monitoring stations, when she had told the Admiral she was not authorized to discuss the vessel's capabilities. He thought about what was behind that face. He did not know. He was fairly sure nobody knew. He thought that was probably, for reasons he could not yet fully articulate, the most important thing that had happened today. The Earth Science Directorate did not know what to do with the Amaranth. This was not unusual. The Directorate was a large bureaucratic organization with very clear procedures for survey vessels returning from mapping missions, and the procedures involved docking reports and equipment assessments and crew debriefs that were filed in a specific order and reviewed by people who had specific titles and specific offices and specific hours during which they could be reached. There was a form for everything. The Directorate had been filing forms for 30 years and was very good at it. What it did not have a form for was this. The first signal reached Earth 3 hours before the Amaranth cleared the outer beacon line, not from the ship, from the Council Relay Network, which had been carrying the story for 2 days by then, in all its varied and contradictory and increasingly elaborate versions. The Directorate's communications office received it, escalated it, received 4 more signals from 4 different council members asking for clarification, escalated those, and by the time the Amaranth was 2 hours out, the situation had moved past the Directorate entirely, and was sitting on the desk of people who had much larger offices and much less clear procedures for what they were looking at. They sent 3 ships to meet the Amaranth at the beacon line. Military ships, not large ones, not the heavy kind, nothing that would read as a provocation to anything watching, but clearly not survey vessels either. They formed up on either side of the Amaranth as it crossed into monitored human space and stayed there, one on each flank, one trailing, and Dessa reported them to Mara, and Mara looked at the formation and said, "Escort," and that was the end of the conversation. They were not an honor guard. They were people trying to figure out what they had. The Amaranth docked at Kepler Station on a Tuesday. The docking itself was unremarkable. The Amaranth had docked at Kepler Station before. It was the standard resupply point for Earth Science Directorate vessels operating in the Outer Reach, and the docking crew knew the ship and knew its quirks, and handled the approach without incident. The ship settled into berth with the particular sound of a vessel that was very tired and had decided not to make a fuss about it. What was remarkable was everything outside the docking bay. Mara walked out of the airlock and into a corridor that had approximately 4 times as many people in it as it normally had, which was already a lot of people, and the people included 3 individuals in military uniforms and 2 in government clothes, and one she recognized from a news briefing she had watched 8 months ago as someone who held a position with a long title and a great deal of authority. There was also a journalist who had somehow gotten past the security checkpoint and who took 11 photographs of Mara in the first 6 seconds and then was removed. Mara looked at the people in the corridor. The people in the corridor looked at her. She said, "I'd like to change my shirt first." The debrief took place in a room that was officially a conference room and functionally a room where important people sat across a table from each other and decided what was true. It had good lighting, which meant the lighting was neutral and revealed nothing, and comfortable chairs, which meant the chairs were the kind that made you feel like you should sit up straight. Mara sat up straight. Yusuf sat next to her and slouched slightly, because he was Yusuf. Rena had her datapad and was using it openly, which the officials across the table occasionally glanced at with mild concern. The people across the table included a military admiral named Harrow, a government official from the Foreign Relations Division named Stain, a scientist from the Advanced Research Division whose name Mara had not caught, and a woman at the end of the table who had not been introduced and who had the quality of someone who did not need to be. Admiral Harrow spoke first. He was a careful man, compact, somewhere in his late 50s, with the particular manner of someone who had spent a career reading rooms and knew he was reading this one. He asked them to walk him through the incident from the beginning. He used the word incident, not engagement, not conflict, incident. Mara walked him through it. She was thorough, she was clear, she did not embellish and she did not minimize. She explained the drive malfunction and the feedback loop and Rena's suggestion about the propulsion coupling and Yusuf's implementation and the unintended side effects and the Varric fleet's response and the conversation with Tasik and the accidental displacement that had knocked out the science vessel and the fleet's withdrawal and the drive stabilization and the return home. She told all of it. When she finished, the room was quiet. Admiral Harrow looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Let me make sure I understand what you're telling me," he said. "Yes," she said. "The drive malfunctioned." "Yes." The engineer improvised a repair that created an unintended gravitational effect. "Yes." The ship could not be targeted as a result of this effect. "That's what Rena's analysis suggests," she said. "You should read her paper. It's thorough. The Varric Empire's fleet fired a full salvo and missed because the ship displaced at the moment of firing. The ship displaced because Yusuf pulled a coupling loose to prevent the array from burning out," she said. "The timing was coincidental." Harrow looked at Yusuf. Yusuf nodded. "I didn't know they were firing," he said. "I was in the floor." Another quiet. "The science vessel was disabled," Harrow said, "by a shockwave generated when the engineer was implementing a secondary modification." "Configuration C," Yusuf said helpfully. "I wouldn't have predicted the amplitude spike. In retrospect, I should have modeled the secondary coupling interaction more carefully." The scientist at the end of the table made a sound. Harrow looked at him. The scientist composed himself. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's..." "Continue." Harrow turned back to Mara. "And then the fleet withdrew." "Yes. Because of what they believed about the vessel." "I assume so," Mara said. "I don't know exactly what they believed. I told the Admiral I wasn't authorized to discuss the vessel's capabilities, which was true. I am not, in fact, authorized to discuss capabilities we don't have." And then he left. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. "Captain Solis," he said, "that is the story we are going to have a very hard time telling." Mara looked at him steadily. "That's the story that happened," she said. The woman at the end of the table who had not been introduced wrote something down. The official story was classified. Level 4, indefinitely. The Amaranth crew signed documents. The documents were long and specific about what could not be said and to whom. Yusuf signed his without reading it, which was his standard approach to paperwork. Rena read hers 3 times and asked 2 clarifying questions about whether the classification applied to scientific publications or only to personal statements, because she had 17 pages of notes on the gravitational fold mechanism and she intended to publish them. The official told her the science could be published without operational context. She said the science was the operational context. The official said she would need to work with the Advanced Research Division on appropriate framing. She said fine. She had the math, the framing was secondary. The paper she eventually published was titled Anomalous Metric Distortion as a Byproduct of Feedback Loop Amplification in Gravity Mapping Arrays, Observations from the Orin Rift Survey. It was 46 pages long and contained 17 diagrams and 1 footnote that said in its entirety, "The author acknowledges that the practical implications of this work are significant and wishes to note that they were entirely unintentional." It won every award available in human physics that year. 3 of those awards had not previously been given to a living recipient. The Varric Empire issued a statement 8 days after the fleet withdrawal. The statement was measured, formal, and used the phrase, tactical reassessment, 4 times. It did not mention the Amaranth by name. It did not mention Admiral Tasic by name. It described the withdrawal as a deliberate pause in operations pending analysis of new data, the kind of language that required a great deal of careful construction, and communicated, in its very carefulness, the shape of what had actually happened. No one believed the statement. No one said they didn't believe it, because diplomatic relations required that everyone pretend to believe official statements, even when the statements described as a tactical reassessment what had clearly been a fleet of 43 warships turning around because they couldn't figure out what one small ship was doing. Tasic's removal from command was announced 2 weeks later. The official reason was health. The announcement used the word retirement. There was no ceremony. He went to a colony world in the inner reach and was not heard from again. And when journalists tried to find him, they found a man who had nothing to say, and said it in a way that suggested he intended to continue saying it for the rest of his life. He had served the Empire for 22 years with complete distinction. Nobody wrote much about that part. The diplomatic contacts started arriving before the Amaranth was unloaded. 14 species, council members mostly, with 2 independent systems who were not council members but had been watching the relay traffic and had drawn their own conclusions, and wanted to draw them in the direction of Earth. The contact requests were formally worded, but their meaning was clear in the way the meaning of formally worded things was always clear to anyone paying attention. We would like to know you better than we did before last week. The Foreign Relations Division was not prepared for 14 simultaneous contact requests. They were prepared for 1 or 2. They had protocols for 1 or 2. For 14 they had to improvise, which was not a word the Foreign Relations Division liked, but which was, under the circumstances, the only available option. Stain, the official from the debrief, spent 3 weeks doing almost nothing else. He reported to his supervisor that the volume and quality of incoming diplomatic interest was unlike anything he had encountered in 15 years of the job. His supervisor asked him what had changed. Stain looked at him for a moment. The Varric retreated, he said, from a survey ship. Everything that thought it knew where humanity ranked has to recalculate. His supervisor thought about this. We should be careful, he said. We don't want them to think we're more than we are. Stain thought about a woman in a conference room, telling an admiral that the story that happened was the story that happened. He thought about an engineer in a ship's floor, improvising, not panicking, pulling couplings in the dark. He thought about a researcher with 17 pages of notes and the absolute calm of someone who had just watched a miracle and was already trying to understand the math. I'm not sure, he said carefully, that we know what we are yet. He went back to the contact requests. The Quellan ambassador reached Earth 6 weeks after the incident. She was the first Quellan to visit Earth. Her species had not had contact with humanity before the survey mission. They were far out, on the edge of contested space, and the practical opportunities for contact had not presented themselves. She arrived at the Earth Diplomatic Reception Facility on a morning in early spring, and the receiving official shook her hand, and she held the handshake slightly longer than the protocol required. We named the day, she said. Her translator gave her voice a soft, resonant quality. The day the fleet turned, we named it. I heard, the official said. We also named the ship. She looked at him. Her eyes were large, amber, the eyes of something that had spent a long evolutionary history watching the horizon for things that might be coming. In our language it means something like, the one that did not know it was dangerous. The official smiled. That might be the most accurate description I've heard. Is the captain here? The Quellan ambassador asked. She's not on Earth, the official said. She left 3 days ago. The ambassador tilted her head. For where? Another survey mission, the official said. Different sector. Mapping work. The ambassador was quiet for a moment. She went back, she said. After all of that, she said the Kepler drift anomalies weren't going to map themselves, the official said, and her engineer had fixed the drive properly this time, so she didn't see a reason to wait. The ambassador looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something in her own language before the translator caught up. 4 words, soft, that the translator rendered as, yes, that makes sense. Pieth filed his final report on the incident, 63 days after the Amaranth left the rift. It was the longest report he had ever written. It was also the last report he wrote from the monitoring station at the edge of the Oran system, because 3 weeks after the incident, the council had decided that the station required a senior observer, and Pieth, after 11 years of careful and thorough and completely unread work, was being transferred to a more visible posting. He was not sure how he felt about this. He filed the report anyway. He was careful with it. He took his time. He included everything: the sensor data, the timeline, the Varric fleet movements, the displacement events, the firing solutions that failed, the science vessel going dark, the withdrawal, the news traffic, the diplomatic contacts, the Quellan ambassador's statement. He included everything except the last part, which he wrote separately, after everything else was done, and which was not really analysis and not really observation, and which he filed because he had decided he owed it to the record to try to say what he actually thought, even if what he actually thought was not the kind of thing observers were supposed to put in reports. It read as follows: I have studied humanity for 11 years. In that time I have filed 2,347 reports. I have catalogued their vessel traffic, their survey patterns, their diplomatic contacts, their growth rate, and their resource consumption, and their gradual expansion through the outer reach. I have described them in my reports as a minor species, spacefaring for 2 centuries, no significant military presence, no territorial holdings, no particular leverage in council politics. I have described them as non-threatening. I am revising that assessment, not because of what their ship did in the Oran Rift. I have considered the incident carefully, and I believe I understand what happened. A malfunctioning drive, an improvised repair, a series of unintended consequences that a Varric fleet could not classify and therefore could not address. It was not a demonstration of military capability. It was not a test. It was not a strategy. That is, in fact, the reason I am revising my assessment. A species with a plan is legible. You can read a plan. You can build a response to a plan. You can calculate what they will do next if you understand what they are trying to do. What I watched in the Oran Rift was not a plan. It was 11 people in a broken ship, doing whatever was necessary, for as long as was necessary, with whatever they had. The engineer did not know what he was building. The captain did not know what she was protecting. The scientist did not know what she was discovering. They were trying to go home, and they could not be stopped. I want to be very precise about this because I think precision matters here. The Varric Empire has fought 17 major engagements in the last century. In every engagement, they won because they had more force or better positioning or superior numbers. Force and positioning and numbers are things you can plan for. They are things you can counter. You cannot counter 11 people who do not stop. You cannot target improvisation. You cannot build a firing solution against a species whose primary response to being in danger is to fix things. I am recommending Level 1 monitoring of all human vessels, effective immediately. I am also recommending that the Council review its classification of humanity as a minor species. I do not think that classification is accurate. I do not think it has been accurate for some time. I think we have been watching the wrong things. I want to note, for the record, that I asked Captain Solis, through an intermediary, after the incident, whether the encounter had frightened her. She said, "We were more worried about the coffee machine. It's been broken since Tuesday. I have been thinking about that answer for 63 days. I am still thinking about it. I do not know exactly what it means. I know it means something. I know that a species whose captain, after 11 hours of surviving something that made a Varric fleet retreat, is primarily concerned about the coffee machine. I know that species is not finished surprising us. I know that much." End of report. The Amaranth reached the Kepler drift on a Thursday. The drive was running clean. Yusuf had spent 2 weeks at Kepler Station with 3 other engineers and a diagnostic suite that was newer than anything on the ship, and the result was a propulsion system that worked the way it was supposed to work, which was stable and predictable, and not at all like what it had done in the Rift. He had also, quietly, written up his notes on the grav array modification and sent them to Rena, who had incorporated them into a supplemental appendix to her paper. The Kepler drift was a wide band of young stellar material, gas clouds and protostars and gravitational eddies, that made survey work slow and the results scientifically interesting. Nobody had mapped it properly. It was the kind of place the Amaranth was built for. Mara stood at the viewport on the first morning and looked at it. It was not scenic the way planets were scenic. It was big and dark and full of things that would take months to measure and longer to understand, and the light that came through it was the scattered, indirect light of a region still figuring out what it was. She thought it was beautiful. "Drive is ready," Yusuf said from behind her. He had coffee. The machine was working. It had been working since Dessa fixed it, and Mara had decided she was giving Dessa a commendation when they got back, because some things mattered. "Good," she said. "Rena has already started a preliminary scan from Doc and has 17 hypotheses she wants to test." "Of course she does. Dessa wants to know if we're running the standard survey grid or something custom." "Custom," Mara said. "Start at the eastern edge, work inward." Course plotted. She looked at the drift for another moment, at the dark and the scattered light, and the slow, ancient process of matter becoming something it wasn't yet. "Let's not die today," she said. "Working on it," Yusuf said. The amaranth moved into the dark. Behind it, the stars were the same cold and particular many they always were in deep space, and ahead, the drift waited with 11 months of work inside it, and somewhere far back across the outer reach, a Varric empire was reading sensor data it couldn't explain, and 14 species were filing diplomatic requests, and a Quellan ambassador was telling the story to anyone who would listen, and a council observer was on his way to a new posting, with 63 days of thinking he still hadn't finished. The amaranth didn't know any of that. It just moved forward, the way it always had, old, patched, slightly improbable, full of people with things to do, into the dark, into whatever came next.